welcome to all of you here today, and it's an honor to be on a panel with Ambassador Mitchell. So, Ambassador, thank you for joining us here today. Just to give you a few top-line thoughts and also sort of a note of why I recently went back to Myanmar. So I've been traveling to Myanmar for the past 6 years, since 2012, going about every 6 months, except since the election. I haven't been back since the 2015 election until last April, or this April. And the reason I went back is that it's kind of an overall thought. Obviously, the persecution and horrible treatment of the Rohingya population in Myanmar is horrible, and it's real, and kind of full stop there. But I also want to say that the international conversation is really solely focused on the Rohingya, and I think that's both to the detriment of the Rohingya in Myanmar, but also to Myanmar's overall political and economic development. So I wanted to go back to the country and kind of see where things stand in the transition, what challenges there were overall that remained, and kind of take stock of that and figure out what positive ways forward there could be. So with that, I had kind of focused on 5 challenges really remaining in the country and opportunities for a positive way forward. And I'd say those challenges in my mind are really the violent ethnic conflict that's happening in the country. So it's not just the situation with the Rohingya, but there's also been a 70-year civil war happening in Myanmar that's still ongoing and has intensified, actually. So there's been a lot of very intense warfare in the northern part of the country at the hands of both the military and the ethnic armed groups. There are still a lot of uneven and poor government communications happening. The government is still very lean. It requires a lot of additional technocrats. Facebook is being used as the mode of putting forward statements and not the most positive and useful way. There's still been slow economic reform and development. There are huge rule of law and challenges with the Constitution, which was written by the military 10 years ago. And then there's just some challenges with the kind of unbalanced geostrategic power and risk and kind of political plays that are happening around the country. So those were kind of my top line thoughts and really the impetus for me writing this report.
Thank you, Debra. You used a phrase at the top, the international conversation, and I think you used that, and that's that's something I'd like to maybe have you jump right in on, Ambassador Mitchell. Obviously, the international conversation has changed even in the 2 years since you left the country. But Debra makes the point, not just now, but in her paper, that while Suu Kyi has squandered international goodwill, that this is not a time to really go after her too hard. It's a moment for the international community to re-engage. That sounds, from here anyway, like a tough sell. What are your thoughts, and what do you think should be a bigger part of that conversation right now?
Right. Well, first, thank you, Tom. Thank everybody here for coming out on a Tuesday morning. And Debra, really an outstanding report. Congratulations on this. It's an honor to be back. I think Debra hit it on the head when you talk about how should we be viewing this country. It is a complex place. It's become quite I think it's a cliche to say it's complex. Some things are complex, some things are not. When you deal with the issue of the Rohingya, nothing is complex about ethnic cleansing, nothing is complex about human rights violations, nothing is complex about violence against a population that has no citizenship rights, no protection by anybody, really, which is why the international community has to step in, is because no one is protecting them. So therefore, it is incumbent on the international community to do so on their behalf and speak for them. Nothing about those issues is complex. But this country is complex, like every country is. And we were talking before about how traditionally we view this country in very simplistic terms. It was the lady and the junta. Very easy. It was what got me interested in the place, because the lady is such a unique figure and represented something even greater than Myanmar itself to people. She was an iconic image of democracy and human rights around the world. But as we scratched the surface of the country, I became ambassador, envoy first, and then ambassador. You realize that every individual is more complex than than an iconic image would suggest. And every country is more complex than a duel between a military and a single individual. And in fact, you find what used to be one of the easiest countries to understand. When you scratch, you realize it's one of the most complex countries to understand because there's a civil war, because there's division, there is no trust inside the country now after 50 years of military degradation. No institutions exist. So that part of it is less interesting to people because that's when your head starts to spin and you go, no, I just want something simple. I need a simple narrative to understand. So it went from a single issue of the lady and the junta, the lady to define the issue, or democracy to define the issue. Now it's the Rohingya. It's become a single issue country once again, which is not to say that the lady is not important or the Rohingya are not important. We're talking about, I'm sure, the lady's complex, reputation and role in this. But we have to look at this country as a country, not a cause. And just like those who do Vietnam, we used to say it's a country, not a war. And I think to many of us, and I was one of those as well, where it was a cause for many years. And it's a country with all the complexities that come with a country. And that's what I think we have to get at, not just to get the U.S. relationship right, but frankly, to get the Rohingya issue right. Because if we don't understand its full context and its full complexity, we will not be able to find solutions that help them deal with this really, really a very, very difficult historical issue.
Wow, so you put a lot on the table. Thank you. And by the way, in the context of the conversation Ambassador Mitchell was just referring to, having spent a lot of time in the media, I think there were two gigantic problems that are relevant to this conversation in terms of what, first of all, didn't pay probably nearly enough attention to begin with to Myanmar or Southeast Asia in general. But when we did, that simple narrative was very appealing back then and probably still is today. There's a phrase that Debra uses in her report, and maybe I can get a word from both of you on this first from the author. The thickness of the tightrope Aung San Suu Kyi must walk between her concern for human rights and the will of the Myanmar military. So we're back to the lady, but in the current context. Why does a woman that has the stature she has, not just on the world stage, but in her country, have to worry about that kind of tightrope?
Sure. So this has been kind of the main narrative that's been out there. Is Aung San Suu Kyi to blame for this? What, is the knife at her back by the military? Kind of how thick is this tightrope that she must walk in order to kind of stand on her human rights and democratic norm bona fides versus, the military's forced expulsion of the Rohingya. There's another kind of interesting issue at hand here in that, domestically in the country, the Rohingya are not, a well-liked people. Nobody in the country is really lobbying for the citizenship of these people, for even the appropriate treatment of these people. Frankly, domestically, the military is actually being seen in a positive light now because they expelled, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which was this group of insurgents that attacked Myanmar's border guard and was part of the impetus for this forced expulsion and ethnic cleansing. So, there are people who are quite happy with the military for eradicating the domestic terrorism issue and for moving the Rohingya out of the country. So the tightrope that Aung San Suu Kyi is really walking here is, does she stand on these human rights bona fides? Does she listen to the domestic population? Does she listen to the international community? Is the military kind of threatening her and saying, this is the path that we want to walk forward on, and you don't really have a say because the government in Myanmar is quite bifurcated. So there's the civilian government, which she leads, but the civilian government doesn't exercise any oversight of the military. So they have their own ability to basically do what they will. So it's these kind of very complex, interconnected challenges about the narrative of the Rohingya, where the military wants to go with these people and what the domestic population actually wants, that are causing her to have to figure out what's my next step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good points all, especially the one, Debra, you make about attitudes in the country towards the Rohingya. We had Burmese journalists here a few weeks ago on the occasion of a prize that we give here at the Asia Society to excellence in journalism in Asia, and even journalists who were very critical of Aung San Suu Kyi in other ways made the exact same point that that the Rohingya are not, they don't have a constituency there. But I want to, at the risk of oversimplifying again, former journalist that I am, I want to double down a little bit on the question about her. Now, are we wrong to, I mean, again, one wonders whether a person who was, by all accounts, in the old days anyway, quite brave and went out on all kinds of limbs and at personal risk to say and do what she did, are we wrong to expect that she might at least utter some words of sympathy, or I'm not sure if she's even ever used the term Rohingya. It goes back to that tightrope question. What are your thoughts about that?
Personally, I think it's a credible critique to say that she should be saying more on the principles. Mm-hmm. I think even though she has said and tried to redefine herself, she said, I never wanted to be an icon. I've always been a politician. Now, people can look at that and say, well, she certainly played the icon and played that very effectively during the days of house arrest in the old days. But from very early on, when I was envoy, she made that point. I am a politician. Why do people keep telling me I need now to be a politician? I've always been a politician. So the irony is, in some ways, that the creation of a more open society, and now you have politicians who have to run for office and appeal to the public, that can work against, because of everything, what Debra said, work against people being too brave or too out front of what their own people think about some of these issues. Now, she's a unique individual in this country. And what I think the international community invested in her, and what the country, I think, invested in her, is that she's not just an ordinary politician. She's somebody who was, the daughter of the founder of the country, who represented something more. So she should have the ability to speak on principles of what this new country that she is leading, that she wants to found, should be based on. Human rights principles, democracy principles, due process, equal justice for all, whether you are a citizen or not, et cetera. So I think it is credible, and I had many conversations with her about that before she was in power, obviously, where I encouraged her to be more vocal on some of these issues. It wasn't that she didn't believe them. It's just for some reason she hasn't done enough of that. And she may believe in her own mind she has done it. Mm-hmm. I used to say, why don't you do it? She says, well, I have done it. I have said this or that. So partly it can be, I think, fear of the popular backlash, fear of being boxed in by the military if she gets too out front on what is considered a national security issue, that she's not tough enough on national security. I do think that's in her mind. Or she just is not very effective at understanding how she can talk about this in a safe and principled way that doesn't hurt her as a politician. Now, other people ask, maybe she's racist, or maybe she doesn't believe these things. I don't know about that. I never got that sense when I talked to her. I think she believed in the right things for these people. I think she was very sincere in that. But she has done a very ineffective job, I think, publicly in demonstrating to the external audiences that she gets it. And if I may say, I don't want to go on too long, but I think this is where we talk past each other, the international community and her. The key on building trust in a relationship is when you feel the other side gets it, gets where you're coming from. And I think she doesn't think we get it, and we don't think she gets it. Mm-hmm. And she thinks we don't understand how difficult her situation is, that the military still has control and the Constitution hasn't changed. The military still controls the administrative levers of power, that they have enormous power still inside the country, and that this issue is very, very complex. Even the Rakhine people in the Rakhine state are very extreme on this issue, and she can't run against them. So she feels we think of it very simply and we don't get it, so she doesn't want to listen to us. Mm-hmm. And of course, we say to her, you don't get it, you're not speaking out on these issues the way you should. You need to recognize that there is something awful going on here that requires leadership. Where is your leadership? So we end up talking past each other, which is unfortunate, which is why I think we do need to find a way to get through to her, build that trust again, which I think has been frayed, so we can have really practical conversations about solutions.
So that gets right to the recommendations, which are almost always the toughest and most interesting things to jump into in a situation like this. Debra has a list of recommendations, and high among them, both for the United States and other countries, is greater engagement, what you're just saying. Yeah. What does greater, apart from how hard it might be to sell that in this country, Let's start with the United States. What should the United States be doing to do exactly what you just laid out in terms of, I guess, avoiding this mutual misunderstanding that is in place at the moment?
Yeah. Well, each side has a responsibility here. I mean, given what we're facing literally today in the next several months is the prospect of a humanitarian disaster with the Rohingya. The monsoons have arrived. Everything we feared most, that they're not ready for the monsoons and that can create both health and just other humanitarian problems for these people on basically flat plains. If something happens, there's disaster there, it's very difficult to get on top of this issue. So the government really needs to be, with Bangladesh, needs to work on ensuring these people have their safety, their dignity, and a credible process forward for dealing with the core issues of citizenship, et cetera. There has to be a credible, transparent process. I should also say today, as well, you have a new UN Special Envoy to Myanmar who's arriving. That's an extremely important development. A fresh opportunity for somebody who is objective, who can come in without much baggage and build trust and be kind of a trusted mediator, in essence, not official mediator, but trusted interlocutor on these issues. I sort of see it like when I arrived as envoy, and she can do that. And what I understand is Aung San Suu Kyi is very excited about this. And she's the wife, she herself is a diplomat, but she is the wife of my old colleague, the Swiss ambassador to Myanmar. So she knows about this issue and she's immersed in it. So that's the first thing, they have to help.
Jump in on that? Kofi Annan was the last, correct? The last special envoy?
No. Well, he did a special commission looking at Rakhine State. Yeah. She's the envoy, I think, for broad issues in the side of the country, probably spending much of her time working on Rakhine. But Kofi Annan was looking at that specific component of recommendations for dealing with the Rakhine issue. So I think that's an opportunity. So they have to help us create the space so that we can do more. On our side, I think we need to build, and I hope this will happen soon, is senior level relationships. We don't have that. I was lucky because I had President Obama, I had Secretary Clinton, starting with Clinton, and then Obama, building these trusting relationships. So I knew when I worked out there, I had backing, and it was at a very senior level. It doesn't exist now. And Secretary Tillerson went last November, which was hopeful, but of course he's gone, and even that, I think, soured very quickly but we'll get into the reasons, but it soured pretty quickly. So I doubt we're going to get a new Secretary of State focused on that. His new best friend is in North Korean leadership. But there needs to be some kind of senior trust built where you have a dialogue on a regular basis so that there are no surprises. There is trust built. You can get in messages at the most authoritative levels and keep that going. That, I think, is what's missing in terms of, quote, engagement. Otherwise, you're going to be just hitting, I think, some of the symptoms and not the full disease.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with the ambassador, obviously, completely. As he was just saying, we do need those senior interlocutors. I think actually there are some in Congress who would be appropriate interlocutors that she knows well and trusts that are unfortunately very strongly focused on domestic issues and are unable to focus on reaching out to her in a positive way. And then I think there are things that the U.S. can do to aid Myanmar on the ground on the non-Rohingya issue. There's just a huge lack of capacity in myriad sectors there where they do need technocrats to help them, in the economic space and in other spaces where I think the U.S. could be of assistance there as well.
I'm reminded as you say that, Debra, that I think it's 5 years ago now in this room, in that what I described as a euphoric moment. So you would have just arrived, I think, in country, Ambassador Mitchell, when we had an event here which we called something like Roadmap to Prosperity in Myanmar, because the Asia Society, I mentioned we'd had a long relationship. The idea there was to leverage that a little bit and bring a whole bunch of stakeholders here. And it was very much a business conversation and a commerce conversation because that seemed to be the problem. They were going to have a happy problem of how to handle this big influx. What is the current political situation and everything we've been talking about? What's the impact current and perhaps medium long term on that path to prosperity.
You mean the investment
Yeah.
situation? Well, even then, I think it was. We get sort of manic depressive about the country. And I think, and I was irrational exuberance, kind of euphoria. I was never, and I used to get asked this all the time: are you optimistic or pessimistic? When I was there, and I hated that question because my job is not to be optimistic or pessimistic; it's to be realistic about what the challenges are and try to work every day to make them better. And I think. People thought this was the new frontier of Asia, the new green field, and they're going to rush forward across this new last green field in Asia, which now they're saying is North Korea. Is the other. I just heard this overnight. They're talking about this new green field.
The beaches.
The beaches, right? The beaches. Watch the video it's out there. The video of what North Korea's beaches can be. But there's also reality, which is a lot of what Debra said. The infrastructure isn't there. Both the physical infrastructure as well as the legal infrastructure and the capacity, institutional infrastructure. So, the businesses rush there. And after a couple of days, they were at the bar at the hotel going, "Oh, it's going to be a long time." There's no water, no electricity, there's no legal, regulatory reform. They're still working on all this. There's a new Companies Act coming out that could be implemented. Actually, it was passed, but the implementation regulations come out in August. That will allow, I think, more companies to feel confident moving in. So it's moving slowly, but the fundamentals aren't there. Even if sanctions are basically off. There's still reputational risk because of the Rohingya issue. Mm-hmm. So now companies once again are being asked, why are you working in a country in Myanmar when human rights abuses are rampant? So it moves much slower than the euphoria. Everything moves much slower than the euphoria will ever suggest.
So one more question from me, and then we'll go to the room and beyond. And this is certainly something that I think was not in play when you were there, Ambassador, but Debra made brief mention of Facebook, and the term fake news has currency in that country now. There's a lot of really, really awful stuff, even by the standards we've seen here and in other parts of the world. Why don't, rather than my describing, talk a little bit about what's going on in social media in that country and what you think can or should be done about it.
Sure, and I will just say the ambassador was there when Facebook had exploded in Myanmar, but I'll make a few points. So, Myanmar went from a completely closed society, nobody really had cell phones and SIM cards my first time there. I rent like a phone that's the size of this bottle or bigger, at the airport for over $100, and it does nothing except text a few people. And now you have smartphones everywhere, and you can get your 3G network with unlimited data and unlimited text for $5. I mean, it's really just leapfrogged in terms of technology in that way. SIM card penetration is at over 100% in the country. 80% of the country have smartphones. So there's now this new ability to really connect that people just didn't have before. Facebook seems to be the platform in which they're connecting to the point that people actually think Facebook is the internet. So this is kind of where everything lives, is Facebook. That's a problem in that, there's no fact-checking on Facebook. The narratives that Facebook gives you are somewhat self-selected, right? The feeds are all based on algorithms. And so there's a lot of information that's put out on Facebook that is, fake or unchecked. There's a lot of propaganda put out on Facebook, whether it's on the Buddhist side or the Muslim side, but, propaganda that works to incite violence. A lot of Buddhist monks have been using Facebook, Buddhist Nationalists, monks, I should say, to incite violence, as I mentioned. And there's just no real way for people to kind of check if this is real or fake. And so it's working to coalesce people in a really negative way, to the point that Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have been called out on this a number of times.
So I stand corrected, Ambassador. You were in the middle of this, or at least in its creation. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. In fact, right after President Obama went for the first sitting president visit to Myanmar in 2012, I went to Silicon Valley to talk to them about how this is an opportunity, too, to open up at Microsoft, Google, Intel. These were icons of young people, as they are all over the world. You'd see the T-shirts all over Yangon, of Google. And So it was an opportunity to link up the country, to open it up as a small aperture and provide access to information that they didn't have for many, many years. But as the Chinese say, when you open a window, flies come in. And as we find that we found this everywhere in our own country too, that those who see the opportunities for negative use of these technologies move faster oftentimes than those who see the positive. So, some of these actors who want to peddle hate, that they use that much more effectively, more quickly. And the problem, this is a country that operates on rumor. I mean, they always operate on rumors and conspiracy theories. Now they had an opportunity to move it much quicker and much more widespread than they ever did, rather than through CDs or DVDs quietly through villages. Now this just goes boom, way out quickly, and catching up to that is difficult. And we saw this in real time. I won't go into it. This would be a much longer conversation about how we dealt with that. And I tried to get Facebook's attention in those days and couldn't. But now they're owning up to that responsibility. And then the question now is how far they're willing to go. And they're doing much more, even just recent days and weeks, on taking hate speech off. But that's good. It's important. But it's not just about that. There must be a much bigger campaign also to promote positive speech, to do digital literacy, as well as, I think, brand Facebook out there, put their face out there, to talk about how to use this app in the right way, the right type of speech, and the right way of reading what you see on the web. I think they need to take more ownership of what's occurred.
Some would say we could use some of that training here too, right?
Yes.
So we'll open up to your questions. If you don't mind, just tell us who you are, press the little button, and off we go. The gentleman to my right. Yeah.
Hi, my name is James Harbison. I used to work at Public Radio International. I'm interested when Tatmadaw assassins killed Kony while he was holding his grandchild. Why didn't Aung San Suu Kyi attend his funeral? And what is the appropriate response of foreigners to assassination of the guy who was going to rewrite the Constitution and push forward judicial reform? I found it interesting that our scholar here, in her priorities, as far as I understand them, I'm just being introduced to her as a scholar, didn't mention judicial reform as one of the major priorities of the country. Maybe that's later in the article, maybe that appears. But I'm wondering, like, if Aung San Suu Kyi is a proponent of the colored laws, if she's an author of the genocide, or at least an apologist for the genocides, if she's a nationalist, a Burmese nationalist, and doesn't want to bring wealth to the Kachin areas, or even autonomy to the other areas that are not Burmese in Myanmar. Why are we showing such a bias as Westerners and the United States in general to Aung San Suu Kyi? It seems a little bit weird that we're putting so much faith in someone who even this morning, I talked to Su Sun Wei, who's a labor union activist. She's a Burmese person, and she said that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party are trying to suppress civil society, and particularly the creation of labor unions, because they're trying to consolidate power in their part of Myanmar. They're part of the government. If you have a government that doesn't support civil society, how are you going to change that civil society?
Okay, a lot on the table there. Maybe you want to take the front end, the funeral and that, and maybe judicial reform over here, or however you want to divide. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to start with judicial? Okay.
Sure. So on the judicial reform piece, I actually do lump it into the Constitution section, but I agree there more definitely needs to be done. You know, the Constitution is flawed to begin with. There's military intransigence causing some undermining of the judicial processes underway, which are lackluster to begin with. Rule of law is just a general problem there. It's lacking, So I agree with you there. On the Kony piece, I don't have an answer. Maybe Ambassador Mitchell knows, but I don't know why she didn't attend the funeral. On what you would call bias to Aung San Suu Kyi, in my mind, I wouldn't say it's biased toward her. I'd say that for a long time she was kind of the democracy and rights icon and kind of post to gauge, where the country is going. And now I think, in talking to even civil society actors on the ground there, I would ask what a transition would look like with somebody else in charge and who those people would be. I mean, there are just huge capacity gaps there. There's certainly very many smart people there who could move up in the government, but that training of kind of building political parties, enacting laws, running a country, it's not there for even very active civil society members. I mean, the military has been in control of all levers of power for so long that you just need more people to be active in civil society and to learn what these processes are. So I'm not sure that it's a bias just toward her. It's more that who are the actors that could lead kind of this political development. Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you, Debra. I agree with all of that. Coney, it's funny, I talk to folks who are activists on the ground and supporters of hers, and they don't know why she didn't go, why she didn't say anything, why she didn't go to the funeral. The Coney, speaking of Facebook, I'm on Facebook. I almost never post except for my birthday to thank people if people write to me. And one other, which was when Coney was assassinated. He was a friend, exactly what you say, which is holding his grandchild. I can't get over just the idea. He came out, he was outside the airport, and he was killed in cold blood. He was a great, great man. And I don't understand it. I've never gotten an explanation for it, and there are people I just had this conversation with 2 weeks ago who were in Washington who know her, who said they don't get it at all. So I don't have an answer for it. But it's an important point because that also sent, but it's a bigger, if you look at it in context too, and this may give you some understanding of what she's facing and why she does what she does. That was taken as a signal of impunity. That this was a signal to the NLD and to Aung San Suu Kyi herself that we can come after you if you cross a line. As you say, he was the one responsible for looking at a new constitution, which the military or some within the military, we don't know who's behind it, very likely military people. We don't know how high it would go. There's been no credible follow-up to get justice here. But boy, I got a lot of people telling me that she is very worried for her safety after that. She didn't, and that she has to be very careful. They are very worried, honestly worried, the NLD, about a coup or about violence, etc. I won't get into analyzing any of that. I have no idea the credibility, and everyone here can decide whether it makes sense or not. But they really do believe, and that Coney assassination sent a chill through all the NLD people, including, I think, Aung San Suu Kyi. But I can't say why she didn't speak out and why she wouldn't go to the funeral. As to the bias to Aung San Suu Kyi, I agree with everything Debra said. I would add one additional item. And I used to get this all the time. Maybe we put too much emphasis on her, blah, blah, blah. She was the democratic representative of the people. We're not supporting her. If we support democracy, we support her because she's a democratic choice of the people, including the Kachin people. They voted for her, consciously decided we're not going to vote for our own party. We will vote for the NLD because at this moment we want a unified single-party government because we think she'll speak for us. And we don't want to have division. We don't want the military playing one off the other. Very smart, very strategic. I'd heard this from other civil society people, getting to Debra's point in the old days. They'd say, we may not agree with everything she's doing, but when she passes from the scene, 100 people will take her place. We need it to be unified. The military wants to divide us. So the key to this is support democracy, which means supporting her right now because she's a democratic leader. But do not support what she does in every case. We should be supporting civil society. We should be supporting labor unions, just like we did under the previous government. Stay true to our principles, regardless of who the leader is. Because democracy is not about a single individual. It has to outlast her. It has to be done from the ground up. Those foundations, those institutions, those mindsets need to be developed now. And what we had hoped was that she would provide a cover for development of all of this from the top down. I think many people on the ground, as you suggest, are very disappointed that she hasn't. But that means then we have to support the bottom up but still not give up on a democratic leader, even if we disagree with what she does.
Sometimes, as luck would have it, we have, even though this question, I assume, came in, well, I know because it was handed to me about 10 minutes ago, we have a segue to your question and your answer, Ambassador, that's come in online, and interestingly from an American named John in Myanmar. What are some reasons ASSK, Aung San Suu Kyi, should and should not run again in 2020?
That's up to her. It's a democratic country. She would have to decide, does she want to be, it's a tiring job. It's she could have a lot of responsibility or a lot of power without having to be foreign minister, for instance, or state counselor. The military certainly doesn't like the position of state counselor. They say, according to the Constitution, there's a president. That person should have authority. So we'll leave to her what the positives and negatives are, and I understand that she is thinking about whether it's right for her to run again in 2020. But I think as long as she is around, she is very authoritative and still beloved by her people and trusted. And as Debra suggests, I think an important figure. I think the negative of her, of course, running, I think common conversation is that it doesn't allow space for others to rise. Mm-hmm. And she has to create what comes after her. She has to create space for other politicians within the NLD or other people to develop their own profiles, their own capacities, and have a very smooth transition to a next generation. And that, I think, is maybe a negative that some people might say to her running again in 2020. But again, I will stay out of that debate.
You want to get into the debate?
I agree with the ambassador.
Okay. We have others online. Anybody else in the room? Yes.
Good morning. I wanted to first say thank you all for your perspectives today. It's very helpful and useful for those of us who are just learning about the area. My name is Michelle Kotarev, and I work for PricewaterhouseCoopers in our export controls and trade sanctions practice. So we do a lot of work with, clients who are looking for understanding around these areas. I'm wondering, we touched a little bit on sanctions today, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how the lift on sanctions affected the country over the past few years, and then potential for imposition of new sanctions that I've been reading about recently, how that may affect the country going forward. So if you could just speak a little bit about that, I'd appreciate it.
The sanctions issue is a huge issue, is a defining issue in some ways during the old days, and I think some people want to return it to that. You were for sanctions if you were against the junta, and if you were against sanctions if you didn't mind. I mean, that was how it was portrayed in Washington. They were a litmus test, just like using the term Burma or Myanmar. I'm used to saying Burma. If you said Burma, though, you were the activists and the democracy and if you said Myanmar, you were the generals. It just became very simple that way, and it shouldn't be that simple. In sanctions, before lifting sanctions, I think it was a signal. There were different components of lifting. We had eased it during our days in order to allow businesses to give it a look, but be very smart and responsible as they invested. So we had reporting requirements. We had things that tried to model how Western businesses, American businesses, do things differently, and they can model good labor practices. They could model corporate social responsibility in every respect. We thought that was going to contribute to liberalization, democratization in the country. It was going to lift in a kind of virtuous cycle, which we found was the case. And we heard from civil society that American companies going in during my time were lifting labor standards by their very competition, and their transparency was welcome. And in fact, the people of the country kept saying, we want Western companies here. But it still had a symbolic impact to some degree to say, particularly with the election coming, nothing is normal, completely normal. We want to see how the elections are. We want to see a transition, and then we'll reassess. So the elections happened. Aung San Suu Kyi won, was put into power, essentially, as state counselor. And then you had to look at, okay, what are we trying to achieve now in this new day? There's a proto-democracy. And the assessment was that she needs to deliver. I mean, every government needs to deliver economically as much as anything else to get votes. People need to see their lives change. And the assessment was our sanctions were getting in the way. Simply that as a sanctioned country meant businesses were we don't want the reputation. We have to go to PricewaterhouseCoopers to get it just costs a lot of money to figure out what we can and can't do. So until we have clarity, we don't want to go. It's just not worth the risk. So the decision was made with Aung San Suu Kyi's acceptance, at least to a certain degree. There may be debates over how it happened. I wasn't there. But it says that sanctions need to come off so that businesses felt, okay, we can really take a look. And then that can contribute to democracy delivering, which helps democracy overall. Now with the Rohingya, it's going back to a single issue, reputational country. And people are saying, well, we must reimpose sanctions. The difference now, though, is when you talk to Congress, there really isn't discussion of economic sanctions. It's mostly sanctions on military, maybe military businesses, which creates a little bit of uncertainty, which causes some problems. That will then people are like, well, we can't work with them. Are they connected to this? The military is so woven with the economy. It may also create a problem. But I think I don't think those sanctions are going to pass, is the way it seems, because various reasons. But it still creates, I know, that concern in businesses' mind that they may come back, so maybe we should keep our hands off. It also means that American companies can't work with Japanese companies or others who say, we don't want to be caught up in sanctions, so we're going to keep our hands off. So even the threat of sanctions is having impact. It may not be entirely positive, though I certainly understand that impulse to do something can't be normal situation. And still, I think, has a reputational or an atmospheric kind of impact.
Ambassador Mitchell, at the recently concluded Shangri-La dialogue, I guess the Burmese representative talked about welcoming back the 700,000 Rohingyas. Is this realistic, given that they have not even talked about, they talk about the verification and the nationality issue. To me, I foresee a situation back in 1989 when 100,000 Losampas were sent back from Bhutan. And after 18 years of languishing in those refugee camps, actually U.S. took the bulk of those refugees. Am I wrong in foreseeing this similar situation? Because when the nationality issue is not even tackled, the verification issues, would they go back? Is there a situation where they can go back to their homes? When nationality issue, the very core issue, is not even discussed, and the lady doesn't want to even mention the word Rohingya because they are seen as Bengali Muslim.
I think it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to take a long time. I think it needs to be attempted. I think their current situation is not sustainable, though. I imagine they're going to be there a while. This is where, again, the UN envoy provides an open opportunity. The Annan Commission provides a roadmap of a kind. It's good that Thong Thun, who you mentioned, is saying the right things. That Aung San Suu Kyi is, they're saying some of the right things, but it all is implementation, and it also Bangladesh has to do what they need to do. I think there needs to be an intermediary. There needs to be somebody watching this and pushing that to ensure it happens in a credible way, so that in some ways called balls and strikes. If it's just simply between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and they continue to point fingers at each other, the Rohingya will suffer. If people just simply grandstand and say it's horrible and they need citizenship right away, just give them all citizenship, I think they're going to continue to suffer. There has to be a process that's credible, where it's moving in the right direction, where there are some others, third parties in there to observe, to call out whether it's going right or not. But I hesitate to say it's impossible, because what is the alternative for them and for us on this? I suppose they can go to third countries, but they don't want to go to third countries. Can they go back to their original villages? Yes, they can. It is up to the will of Naypyidaw and the will of the people of the country. And it has to be, I think the case needs to be made in their own terms. They care about their security. They care about their good name. They care about economic development. And all of that, they're not going to get in this current situation. Their security is worse off now than it was before. So I think there needs to be much better diplomacy, much more nuanced diplomacy to get the Myanmar government to understand, and better interactions with Bangladesh to get the implementation moving much more quickly. The use of the word Rohingya, the Rohingya name is a very, very complicated, very difficult issue to overcome. And what I want to focus on is less whether they use the name now, where they deal with these people as human beings who deserve equal dignity to anybody else in the world, certainly anybody else that's deserved in Myanmar. And then the name issue is important, but deal with that later on. I'm more concerned about it as human beings and as a certain name.
To that point, we haven't said much. You both mentioned the humanitarian crisis, and obviously even in the best case of a process going forward that Sanjeev asked about, what about, the monsoon rains are upon us or soon. Are either of you well enough aware to comment on the positioning of relief if it becomes not just a daily trauma that they're going through now, but a full-on, full-fledged massive disaster, which doesn't seem that hard to fathom right now. What's being done? Are the UN and the various aid organizations well positioned? Is there anything we can all do to help in that respect?
So it's also a question of what side of the border you're on. So in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where most of the refugees are, there are over 500,000 people there, close to 1 million people. Aid organizations are there already and have access. On the Myanmar side, in northern Rakhine, where obviously the mass exodus took place, but there are still people there, and in central Rakhine, now the Myanmar government has signed an MOU with UNDP and UNHCR to actually allow these organizations into these areas to help them figure out, one, how to repatriate, but two, just make a better situation on the ground, whereas before they weren't allowed in. And we've seen in the past Doctors Without Borders is not allowed in, and other organizations like that. So, as this access ramps up, I think we'll see that those benefits, or not benefits, but those actors are there. I will say, in order to help, obviously you could donate to the organizations that are working there. But I'd also say that a lot of people in the circles that I'm in want to visit Rakhine and Cox's Bazar, and I find that a little bit weird. For a journalist, it makes a ton of sense. For an aid worker, it makes a ton of sense. For everybody else, read about it, follow the great news, but when you try to go to these places, you're taking time from the people who are working there to actually deliver efforts. So there's this kind of bizarre urge that folks have to say, I want to go on the ground and see how horrible it is myself, but unless you're really able to provide support, you're pulling away efforts.
I mean, one concern, I'll be very quick, is that they say 200,000 people of the 700 or 900,000 people that are there are in imminent danger because of the land that they're on. There have already been landslides. There's already been death of a child because of a landslide. So some people there'll be damage because of rains, but others are really in imminent danger. So that's, and the concern we've had, Bangladesh is saying, well, we don't want to make it too comfortable because we don't want them to feel too comfortable to stay. There's this moral hazard thing. But there are some people that are in really serious situation, regardless of whether you can get aid in afterwards, that may be too late. So it's the will also to either relocate them to a place where you can have stable structures or put somehow stable structures in place. But now with the monsoons happening, it becomes more difficult.
I think we have time for a couple more. Rachel?
Yes, I wish to ask if you can speak a little bit more about the Buddhist community, both the Buddhist Nationalists, and whether there are kind of counter-narratives going on, as well as if there are interfaith groups that are now emerging.
Well, there have been, I think, the Buddhist nationalist movements, formerly known as Mabatha, now the Parahita, I forgot the name, the latest name that they call themselves. We have to be careful on this. First of all, Buddhist nationalism is okay, or Buddhist pride, Buddhist faith. People that feel that they may be under threat or under siege, you need to protect Buddhism. That's a danger, certainly, whenever you feel you need to protect, or your victims, or there's something out there that you feel is a threat to you. But if you just simply want to promote Buddhism, that's fine. And even parts of Mabatha were much more about promoting Buddhism than being hostile to other religions. But then it crosses that line. And that's where the Rohingya thing crosses. You take both a security threat, and they'll say, look, Muslims are on the march. Look at the region. Look at Middle East. Look at, they'll use a narrative, well, Indonesia, Afghanistan, even Bengal used to be Buddhist, and now they're Muslim. And we're the last bastion of pure Buddhism in the region. We have to protect against this march of Islam. That narrative is very strong. And Rakhine State specifically, they're right across a porous border. And they feel like if Bangladesh just hiccups, then they're overrun. And they already feel that Rakhine, who are very proud Buddhists, they already feel overrun by the Bamar. We don't understand. There's all this history internally where the Rakhine feel actually more victimized by the Bamar, the Burmans, than they even do by Muslims. So they feel that they're besieged on all sides and no one internationally understands them. So we have to take this under our own, we have to take it onto ourselves because the UN doesn't get it. So, we have to be careful as we define Buddhist nationalism that when it starts to become a security threat, not just in terms of religion, but in other terms, that it becomes much more difficult to handle. So we have to, I think, disassociate one from the other. We have to work on Buddhist nationalism as not necessarily a negative thing, but try to appeal to Buddhist peace education to deal with some of the more negative aspects of it. And then final thing, just quickly, there are interfaith groups that come together. We worked on that when I was there as ambassador. There are lots quiet. There are actually rapid response interfaith communities within cities. So you're not seeing what we saw in 2013, 2014, or an incident that was a rumor. Even things that didn't happen would then create people in the streets. People came together, monks as well as imams, so that when there was a rumor, they would talk immediately, tell the constituencies, go back home, we're going to work on this, we'll see if it's true, and now you're not seeing that anymore. So there are antibodies that are forming inside the country, quietly. But there's also this wave, and the Rohingya issue, I think, has exacerbated it, that we're also under siege, we're under threat, which just quickly, when you look at Burma, Myanmar, they're surrounded by huge countries. Yeah. That sense of threat and insecurity is fundamental to how they think about themselves. Surrounded by China, India, Bangladesh, 3 billion people surrounding 53 million. Wow. And we're concerned about Canada, apparently, in Mexico. I used to joke about that and say we're concerned about Canada, and now, my God, it's not a joke. But, I mean, think about what their situation, and I'm not saying it's acceptable to deal with it the way they're dealing with it, but that's the mindset of the country going in. So when something happens, you have to understand this is where they go at it, and how do we then deal with them on their own terms to make them think differently about how to address what they consider a threat to their security.
It's quite a term, antibodies forming in the country. Huh? Yeah. There's a sort of irresistible question online, and then I think this gentleman, and then we probably have to wrap the hour, but maybe we'll take them both. Tell us some good news coming out of Myanmar and how to encourage more of it. And what is your question, sir? Do you still have one? Or yeah.
Thanks very much. Ramy Inocencio at Bloomberg Television. Thank you very much. Through the economic lens, from what I cover, Asia Pacific, I want to know in terms of the opportunities for my audiences that I speak with. They're always looking to see what can be done. I've been to Myanmar twice. The first time, Debra, you talked about not having cell phones there, and I brought mine in and it didn't work. And there was one ATM at the hotel, and that was like the one in the country, I think, at the time. But things have gone leaps and bounds. Singapore has helped the telecoms industry, I understand. Mining is a big thing. Hotels are coming up. An acquaintance of mine has a family that's putting up hotels there. But I don't know what's to know right now. Where are the opportunities as well as the challenges, I suppose?
So maybe there's some good news in there.
On the good news side, and I realize the report and this conversation may sound a bit pessimistic, but again, and it kind of wraps with the title of the report, reconciling expectations with reality. I think our expectations for Myanmar are incredibly high, and part of that was because of Aung San Suu Kyi herself. It seemed like this was a transition that maybe to the outsider looked very easy, but as the ambassador said, Myanmar is incredibly complex, and transitions, of course, take time. So the country has grown economically. It has developed politically. It's still experiencing 7% economic growth per year. It's been reported that they've had the best year for agricultural exports in 50 years this past year, which is tremendous. I mean, the economy is mostly, or the country is mostly agrarian. So when you think about the benefits of economic reform, you want to think about how they hit, all of these rural populations that aren't, just in Yangon and just, former cronies, but really the average person. So there is good news there. It's just not being communicated well, and that's another part of the challenge in the country. Communications are terrible from the government. We talked about Facebook already, but you're just not hearing the government communicate much good or bad news. They stay fairly silent, and so it's left to the rumor mill or to people's ideas of what's good or bad to really. That's really the news that comes out, and it's unfortunate. In terms of opportunities for economic development, all sectors are open to opportunities because the country needs a lot. There have been hopes that the insurance markets would open. There's been a lot of liquidity challenges in the country. The insurance markets seem like a low-hanging fruit kind of area for international business to come into. I think they've been waiting for about a year for it to open. I think that's the next kind of big, easy thing that will hopefully come. Consumption, the consumption sector goods, that's something where there's opportunity. I'll stop there because I'm forgetting my thought.
It's funny because when I went my last trip and I got together with some of my old friends, I started by saying, look, tell me something good. Give me good news. I know what I'm about to hear because all the elites in Yangon are negative on things. But, it reminds me, I call the Mrs. Lincoln principle, though, when you start talking about these things, which is the line, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Other than the ethnic cleansing, tell me something good that's happening there, which is difficult. It's hard to focus on that because of this, as I say, the one issue that's just a glaring black spot in the entire country. But Debra, I think, outlines, what's accurate. In agriculture, I talked to folks on the ground, USAID, friends of mine and others, just the fact that they eased up the regulations on the ag industry and farmers is leading to a tremendous growth in earnings and exports in the dry zone in other parts of the country in the agricultural sector. So we don't hear about that, but that's actually doing very, very well. Infrastructure is being built all over the country, roads. They're talking about ports. I mean, that's moving forward. And so people are seeing in their communities the ability to move crops or move things. They're seeing development of their country in ways that we wouldn't see. It's quiet. This is kind of the foundations. They have a very good minister of electricity and energy, and they have a plan for electricity generation that is moving forward. Not quickly enough. People wanted to see it quicker. I think they got off to a slow start on the economy, but I get a little bit of momentum there, slower than people would like. Look, there's peace in Karen State. There's peace in much of the country, so they're not fighting. People feel hopeful with opportunities, but that's checkered as well because they're not certain about the peace process. We haven't talked about the peace process, but that's not really moving forward. There's just not as much fighting in some areas, but there's increased fighting in others. So that's a mixed review of positive. The media is open. They can't talk about certain things. They can't talk about the military. They can't talk about, open about Rakhine. But there is Frontier media. There are other Frontier magazine that writes some good stuff. It is not what we would like. It has regressed. It's getting worse. Over the past couple of years, they will say it's regressed since the NLD came in, ironically. But again, it depends on, where you're seeing, what your measure is. It's still more open than their neighbors, though I would never compare with others in Southeast Asia. It should be compared on its own merits. So that's, again, checkered, but at least it's a little better. And civil society is more open. I mean, those of us who had worked Myanmar 7 years ago, 8 years ago, would never expected what were the problems we're dealing with now, to a great, with the Rohingya issue being the exception. So I don't want to minimize what's going on, the negatives. of what's happening. We expected more. I think a lot more could be happening. It is not. I don't think our expectations were too exalted to expect better than it is today. But it doesn't mean it's a complete loss. And transitions do take time. They do go back and forth. And I think what we need more than anything is to keep engaged. I think our engagement is critical to help them. We haven't talked about other countries, China and others, who are taking advantage of the opportunity to, and they have no interest in the well-being of this country. I mean, they're looking like anywhere else to take advantage for their own interests. And I think we have to find that principles and not let Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD off the hook when they are regressing on some of the fundamentals of democracy, but also remain engaged to try to help the country get out of its situation that it's in, because I think it wants better, but it's struggling.
Thank you, Ambassador. We've gone a little past time. I want once again to cordially invite you all back for breakfast and coffee at this hour tomorrow. We'll pick apart denuclearization and those beaches and whatever else our guests want to talk about. To Debra, Eisenman, and Ambassador Mitchell, you've given us a ton to think about and exactly what this series is meant to do when we have great guests. So I thank you both. Please, warm thanks to Debra and Ambassador Derek Mitchell. Thank you. It was great. Thanks,